Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As I've just been introduced, I'm Professor Neil Juster. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Glasgow, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the University and to this first lecture in this year's Dalrymple Lectureship Series and to this wonderful venue, the Charles Wilson Lecture Theatre. The Dalrymple Lectureship in Archaeology was established in 1907, so we've been going over 100 years, clearly, in recognition then of the 50th anniversary of the Glasgow Archaeological Society, and was endowed by the bequest of James D.G. Dalrymple. Now, James Dalrymple, or formerly Duncan Dalrymple, studied at Edinburgh and Glasgow universities. He trained in law and was a member of the Faculty of Procurators and practiced in Glasgow. But more crucially, in the context of this lecture series, he had from his childhood a deep interest in archaeology. He served as an officer of the Glasgow Archaeological Society for nearly 40 years, starting in 1877. And for most of the time, he was its secretary. During that time, he did much to revive the society, and it was at the society, as the society's president and on the occasion of the Jubilee dinner in 1907 that he endowed this lectureship. From its inception, the lectureship has been a partnership between the society and the university. The overall responsibility for its continuation and prestige is shared by the Glasgow Archaeological Society and by the university. And I'm delighted to say that one of the lectureship's distinguishing features is under the terms of the endowment, the lectures are always free. So this, apart from their intrinsic value, of course, no doubt adds to the appeal of the lectures and certainly gives them a great value of accessibility. And so, because of Dalrymple's generosity and foresight, which we acknowledge and remember tonight, the citizens of Glasgow and members of the university have both benefited from the extended discourses on European archaeology by leading archaeologists of the day. The list of lecturers serves as a roll call of the great archaeologists of the 20th century and beyond. It remains one of the most prestigious lectureships in British archaeology, and in recent decades has attracted an extremely eminent sequence of archaeologists to the University of Glasgow. And I know in Professor Gavin Lucas, this great and eminent tradition continues. But before I introduce Professor Lucas, may I thank you all for attending tonight's lecture and for continuing the support of the Dalrymple Lectureship Series. I know that the University is pleased to continue to play its part in supporting the series. Now, Gavin Lucas is Professor of Archaeology at the University of Iceland, an institution which he joined in 2006. Currently writing up his major research excavations at Bishop's Seat on Iceland, he began his archaeological career as a teenage volunteer on summer digs in London in the 1980s. His undergraduate degree at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, was followed by doctoral studies with Ian Hodder at Cambridge University. It is in relation to excavation and fieldwork practice that Gavin has made a significant contribution to archaeological theory, with numerous articles and publications such as Critical Approaches to Fieldwork and Understanding the Archaeological Record. He has challenged the way we understand and engage with the past. Much of his career has been spent working on commercial archaeology and on excavations of all periods. This view from the trenches has directly informed his thinking of archaeological practice and has generated cutting-edge practical field methodologies, with his excavations of an Icelandic Viking Age hall described by one reviewer as state-of-the-art. His new book, Writing the Past, published in 2019, is an exploration of the production of archaeological knowledge in light of the subject's theoretical trajectories. Another key area where he has shaped disciplinary thinking has been through archaeologies of the contemporary and historic past. A joint project saw the excavation of an abandoned council house that exposed the discomfort of working with the familiar present. A field project in the Western Cape of South Africa examined the role of material culture in Dutch colonialism, issues that concern his current research on North Atlantic trade and commerce. The Archaeology of Time, the topic of his doctoral research and a 2005 book, is the subject of this year's Dalrymple Lecture Series. Time is a foundational concept in archaeology, given the multiple temporal scales exposed in the intersection of engaging the past in the present. Therefore, without further ado, I now invite Professor Lucas to deliver his first lecture, the first lecture of the 2019 Dalrymple lecture series on the archaeological clock. Thank you. Gavin.
Well, thank you, Neil, for that wonderful introduction and idea. I'd just like to begin by thanking the Dalrymple Board of Curators, the Glasgow Archaeological Society, and of course the Department of Archaeology at the University here at Glasgow for inviting me to give these talks. It's a great honour and a great pleasure to do so, and to revisit a subject, as Neil had said, that I wrote a book about, 7, 8 years ago now. Time, of course, is a really fundamental concept in archaeology, as Neil pointed out. And I just want to also mention, perhaps rather flippantly, and Dorothy might scold me for this, but at the back of the leaflet it says, the theory of archaeology. Well, maybe it's a bit presumptuous of me, but maybe the archaeology of time is, in a sense, the theory of archaeology. So perhaps it's not such a misprint after all. Anyway, I want to begin my lecture tonight, my first lecture, by exploring archaeological time in its most conventional sense and the way we kind of think and use it often unreflectively, which is why I've called this first talk the archaeological clock. And what I really would like to explore is the background to our conception, our everyday conception, our working conception of time in archaeology. And to do that, I guess it's really important for me to recognize that this concept of time that we work with in archaeology is socially constructed. Now, I realize as soon as you say a word like socially constructed, it creates lots of problems for some people, and it raises all kinds of connotations, some good, some bad. I don't want to get into a discussion, maybe this is something we can talk about later, what it is to mean that something is socially constructed. Let me just say, as a kind of warning, though, that when I say that time is socially constructed, I don't mean it's not real, okay? The clothes that we're all wearing in this audience today are socially constructed, I would suggest, but I think we all take for granted that they're real, otherwise we'd be feeling rather embarrassed. So I think there's no kind of conflict between that notion. And the idea that time is a social construct is something that's been discussed for a long time by social theorists and philosophers, going back to people like Emil Durkheim, and of course in contemporary sociology, Barbara Adams has written a lot on this topic. And it's not something I really want to delve into in terms of justifying that idea. What I'd really like to do is explore the historical roots of this concept of time in archaeology, and the historical roots of its construction, and how much work actually went into creating this notion of time, which we just take for granted today. So in a sense, what I'm going to do in my first talk is deconstruct time, which I'll spend the rest of my other lectures trying to pull apart even further. And then we'll see at the end of the time if time ever exists at all. Now, one of the most basic distinctions that archaeologists learn early on is that between what's called relative and absolute dating. These two terms are a little bit problematic, and they'll become more so as I talk my way through tonight. But it is an important distinction which we kind of use all the time. And by relative dating, we're usually talking about things like the sequence of events and the sequence of layers in the ground. By absolute dating, of course, we're referring to dates, calendar dates. Now, relative dating has always been, in a sense, the core of archaeology and of archaeological chronologies. And its classic exemplar, of course, is stratigraphy, which lies at the basis of a lot of archaeological work, as you can see in this profile here. Now, what the core thing is, of course, about relative chronology in providing, exemplified in this notion of stratigraphy, is that what it does is gives you sequence. It tells you that X came before Y. What it doesn't do is tell you how long X was, or how long it was before Y formed. It tells you what was first and what was later, of course, and we're inferring this in terms of its top and bottom in the sequence. Now, this method works very well, not only on a local scale in terms of archaeological sites, but of course we've expanded it. In the 19th century, it was critical to the development of the three-age system, that is the adoption of stone and bronze and iron age. which became the basic backbone of prehistoric chronology, developed in Denmark. And it still very much dominates our thinking today. But for all that, as I said, one of the things that the relative chronology cannot do is it cannot measure duration. It excels at finding sequences, but it cannot tell you how many years these layers represent. For that, we have to go to other things. Of course, we're using things like artifacts and C14 and stuff, but what all these do is essentially provide proxy dates. They give us an absolute chronology. Now, I'm going to focus a lot more on absolute chronology in my talk tonight, less on relative chronology. That's going to be something I'm going to come back to tomorrow, and also this whole distinction between the two. But an absolute chronology, of course, is effectively any system of dating which allows us to peg a calendar date on an event. Now, for a long time, archaeology had a real problem trying to do this. And I think it's important to put this into some kind of historical context. 300 years ago, most educated Europeans, including people like Kepler, Newton, and Descartes, thought that human history, and indeed Earth history, was no more than 6,000 years old. Now, this time span was drawn, as we all know, from biblical chronologies, the most famous of which was developed by the Irish Archbishop Ussher, who in the mid-17th century, who calculated that Genesis began on the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. It's a great date. I remember it because it happens to be my birthday. But actually, he says that the world actually began the evening before the 23rd, which spoils it a little bit. But what he actually meant was time began on the evening of the 22nd. I don't quite understand how that makes sense. I think that's a really philosophical problem, again, I'm not going to go into. Now, a lot of scholars kind of conducted similar methods, but these became kind of standard accepted chronologies right up into the beginning of the 19th century, even into the late 19th century in some cases. And it was basically built, of course, on genealogical succession in the Old Testament, starting with Adam and Eve, begat Cain and Abel, and so on, and building up these long genealogical successions and constructing absolute dates from that. Now, it's easy, of course, to kind of to smirk a little bit at these methods, but in a sense, the same methods carried on being used even into archaeology into the beginning of the 20th century. In a sense, people using, like Flinders Petrie, who used cross-dating, were relying on Egyptian dynastic genealogies and so on, were doing the same kind of things that Archbishop Ussher was doing. It's the same kind of methods. There's nothing wrong with Archbishop Ussher's methods. The thing, of course, we have problems with is his 6,000-year chronology. By the middle of the 18th century, several scholars were already suggesting a longer time scale for an Earth before humans. Buffon's estimates of 75,000 years were kind of expanded over the course of time, and by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the Earth was estimated to be something around about 100 million years, although there was a lot of variation and discussion about how much this was, because as soon as you break out of this 6,000-year bracket, you're having to deal with how on earth you start to estimate absolute dates in the absence of written sources. Of course, people started to rely on things like geological processes and the cooling down of the Earth and so on. There was a lot of disagreement about this. But by the end of the 19th century, the acceptance of Darwinian evolution, the confirmed association of human tools with extinct fauna, enforced the recognition that human history was connected to the development of other life on the planet, and therefore of considerably greater antiquity than the 6,000 years previously imagined. Now, many archaeologists resisted this extension of deep time into prehistory, or history, or what rather became known as prehistory. But of course, these people are often now forgotten in our histories of archaeology and marginalized. By 1900, the archaeological clock of deep time, conceptually, even if not practically, was well established. Actual estimates in calendar years varied a lot, but a common date, for example, for the first use of human tools and our first human ancestors was about 500,000 years old. It's now, of course, been extended by several million years. So it's one thing to recognize that there's a vast period before written history, that this 6,000 years is actually a lot longer than we thought, but quite another to then start to put dates on that. And so the problem is how you do that. Now, as I said, for a lot of these very early periods, it was a lot of guesswork initially based on geological processes and so on. But for later prehistory, it was actually going back to the traditional methods that Ussher had used, relying on genealogical succession, although no longer just purely on biblical accounts. You've now got things like Egyptian dynastic records and Mesopotamian cuneiform inscriptions and so on. And through the use of these other things, archaeologists were enabled to extend these absolute dates into later prehistory. So, for example, Flinders Petrie's use of cross-dating was quite influential in the early 20th century, where basically you had Egyptian dynastic records associated with objects, which those objects were then found in the Aegean, and then they traveled over, and you can kind of continually follow this train of associations until you kind of move up to the northwestern Europe. Of course, you don't have any written sources whatsoever. Now, as of course it became revealed when the first C14 dates came in, this chain of association, this cross-dating was rather fragile. The further it went away from the source of the original dates. So by the time it got into the British Isles and northwestern Europe, some of these dates were turning out to be 2,000 years out than what the original chronology was suggesting. So the first half of the 20th century saw various attempts to develop alternative methods of absolute dating, which of course culminate in the development of radiocarbon or C14. Now, I'm a little bit wary of overplaying technological advances in a discipline to kind of explain major developments, conceptual developments, but it does seem really that in a sense we perhaps take too much for granted today the impact C14 had on archaeology. It was incredibly momentous in changing our narratives and changing the way we thought about prehistory in the past. And it still is having a big impact today as well, particularly in the midst of what's been happening in the last, say, 20 years with the use of Bayesian modeling on these C14 dates to refine the chronologies down to a much tighter scale. And I'll talk more about this towards the end of my lecture. But what I want to do really is spend most of my time really just focusing now on the background to this need for an absolute chronology and the way it kind of frames our archaeological stories. I think it's important to remember what it is we're talking about when we talk about an absolute chronology. Now, as I said, in practice, of course, it means assigning dates, putting things into calendar years. But if we want to nitpick here, the concept of an absolute chronology is a little bit wrong-headed in relation to relative chronology, because what it is that we're actually referring to by the absolute here. The passage of years, in a sense, is no more absolute than the superposition of layers. A year, for example, is just a span of time relative to the rotation of the Earth around the Sun. A year on Jupiter is equivalent to 12 Earth years. All dating systems, in a sense, even based on the solar year, are relative. You don't need to be an Einstein to figure that one out. So, on the other hand, of course, Earth is where most archaeology is, so it's perfectly reasonable to use the solar year as the basis of our chronology. We can call it a strategic, absolute version of chronology, even if it's not absolute. At the moment, there is no serious archaeology in outer space, although I should say there is a space archaeology. Alice Gorman, for example, at the University of Flinders in Australia has been working on space archaeology and the notion of space junk, but I don't think she's had to deal with these questions of chronologies yet. I think for all intents and purposes, sticking to the Earth chronology is fine. So I think nitpicking aside, though, in a sense, what's really more important about an absolute chronology is not that it's absolute in relation to relative chronologies like stratigraphy. It's more the fact that the interval or the time unit that we're using to measure an absolute chronology is regular, more or less. It's more or less I'll come back to later again. What really distinguishes a chronology based on, say, stratigraphy from one based on the solar year is that the duration of the units of succession in one are unknown. In stratigraphy, we've got this sequence of layers, but we really don't know what unit of time these different layers represent. Whereas the solar year, of course, we can more or less estimate is based on a very repetitive and standard unit of time. And that, in a sense, gives us the ability to talk about duration, which we couldn't do with relative dating. Absolute dating enables us to talk about duration, whereas relative dating just enables us to talk about sequence. That's a really important distinction, what it comes down to. In math speak, relative dating gives us an ordinal sequence. Absolute dating gives us an interval series. It's this regularity that really enhances its metrological status and its ability to act as a giant measure, like a giant clock. So when we're talking about absolute chronologies, years and dates, calendar BC and so on, we're talking about dating methods which can be directly or indirectly linked to the solar year as a standard unit of measure. Now, written documents do this, of course, but so do various natural phenomena. And the oldest alternative methods to written sources rely on natural events which leave an annual or cumulative trace, such as the varves in the glacial lake sediments or growth rings in trees, dendrochronology. And these are all developed as dating techniques in the late 19th and early 20th century and have become important parts of the archaeological toolkit. So long as you can tie these sequences into a calendrical system, you're good to go, more or less. But the problem with these methods, varve chronology and dendrochronology, is they're quite limited scope. Varve chronology is linked to glaciers, is confined to glacial regions, whereas dendrochronology really, of course, relies on having the right kind of wood, or any wood at all. And of course, as most archaeologists know, wood doesn't always survive very well on archaeological sites. So these limitations are really, in a sense, why radiocarbon has become the standard and most widespread method of absolute dating, because it doesn't suffer from these limitations. So long as you have any organic-based material, you can get a C14 date. Almost any archaeological site anywhere on Earth will probably have something that can be carbon dated, such as bones, seeds, shells, and so on. But of course, C14 doesn't work like tree rings. It isn't annual accumulation. It doesn't mimic the solar year. To make it mimic the solar year, we have to convert it. We have to calibrate it. C14 does have a tempo. It is a clock of a sort, and we can convert it into it, which is, of course, its decay rate, typically expressed as the half-life of C14, the years it takes an atom of C14 to decay or lose half of its energy. And C14 is just one of several isotopes in radiometric dating, but its usefulness to archaeology is due to the fact that, of course, it's found in organic materials, which are plentiful, and that its half-life of about 5,730 years means that, of course, we can date anything back to about 50,000 years ago. Now, of course, put like that, it sounds quite simple, but as we all know, or at least the archaeologists amongst us know, radiocarbon dating isn't that simple. There's a whole host of factors that need to be considered from the archaeological context of the sample to the calibration of C14 date. Now, I already fear this is turning into a 101 on C14. I didn't really want that to be the case here. But I think in emphasizing this aspect of the work that goes into turning a C14 sample into a date, this really emphasizes the point I'm trying to make here about the role of time construction. Now, one way of defining the work that goes into turning your sample into a date could be called chronometric hygiene. Now, this term was originally devised in the context of radiocarbon dating sites in Polynesia, where the idea was basically sifting out good and bad dates and trying to get rid of bad dates and focus on the good dates to produce a good, reliable dating system. But in a sense, all the work we do in C14 and to try and get that calendar date is conceived as a form of chronometric hygiene. It's about really trying to ensure the reliability of that date, but also convert that radioactive decay into a calendrical date. And if there's one thing we've learnt in the past 50 years of using C14, it's that the work involved in chronometric hygiene has increased quite substantially. All the things that we first thought we had to do are doubled and tripled and so on. So many issues have to be taken into account: atmospheric variation, reservoir effects, isotopic fractionation, and so on and so on and so on. It's not an easy job. And yet this should really come as no surprise. The fundamental task, in a sense, of chronometric hygiene is to make two very different systems of time reckoning align. What we're effectively trying to do is stitch together the tempo of a radioactive clock, the decay of C14, with the tempo of the solar year, the time it takes the Earth to move around the sun. These are two very different physical, natural processes, and we're trying to basically calibrate and synchronize the two. And this, in a sense, in essence, is what all absolute chronology, in a sense, what time reckoning systems which archaeologists use have tried to do. And this is really the point I want to try and make tonight in my discussion of the emergence of this conception of time that lies behind not only archaeology but history, and also all historical sciences. Now, nature and society are replete with cycles and processes of different tempos. Yet the need to bring them together under a single system of time reckoning, I'd say, is very specific to modern Western culture and science. And this is where that slide that I showed earlier should come in. This is a book by Norbert Elias, the sociologist, who wrote a really nice little book on time, essay on time, where he kind of emphasized this aspect about this notion of Western culture trying to produce a synchronization or a synthesis of time as a social construct. That modern time reckoning systems are characterized by this increasing drive towards synthesis and synchronization. Now, Norbert Elias framed his discussion in terms of a much broader universalistic terms than I would, linking it also to his other work he'd done on the civilizing process, and I'm not going to go into that. I think that his general context in which he framed this argument is perhaps we don't need to follow, but I think the idea of this as a kind of more parochial observation of what was happening in Western time consciousness is very, very important. Because it does seem to me that one of the most hidden aspects of an absolute chronology is its singularity. Not the fact that it's linear or it's abstract, which is often what we talk about when we're talking about scientific time or chronology. Rather, that it presents time as a single, unified phenomenon. We almost intuitively think there is just one time. You know, we can all measure different things happening at different times, different events, different bodily processes, and so on, but all this takes place within this singular, uniform dimension of time, or the space-time continuum, or whatever you want to call it. All these things like clocks and calendars are all just measuring the same thing. Now, such a view, in a sense, is really back to front. Is this singular conception of time is actually coming from this long historical process of creating a very singular conception of time through the work of chronologists. And this is this story I really want to emphasize in my lecture tonight, that this notion of singularity is something that we created over the past 300-400 years. And it wasn't easy. It took a long time to achieve this. Now, in characterizing the socially constructed nature of an absolute chronology as singular, all I mean really is it's not natural or a given feature of time, but something that has been constructed, as I said. But calling it constructed is not to demean it. It actually involved a lot of work, as we saw. And there are two key phases to the historical process of singularization that I want to focus on tonight. One is involving the dominance and the emergence and dominance of the Anno Domini system, calendar years expressed in AD and BC, or as we now say, CE and BCE. And the second involving the alignment of clock and calendrical time during the 18th and 19th century. I'm going to start with the first one, this rise of the Anno Domini system. Now, in everyday life, bridging past and present is not really a problem. It's what our memory does automatically, as long as it works, of course. Now, memory certainly has its problems, but it's a faculty we kind of depend on for relating past and present. But the issue here really is how we bridge this past and present relation in contexts that lie outside personal memory. And this is the realm, of course, that archaeology and history deals with, larger time spans. Now, the most common way throughout human history has been to what we call social or collective memory. And again, there's been a lot of work on this in the social sciences about transmission across generations of personal memories through storytelling, material performances, inscriptions, and so on. Now, such methods may or may not be concerned with measuring time in any depth, in any quantifiable way. But for those that were, and here we're generally talking, of course, about societies with characteristics often attributed to state-level societies, state formation and so on. The most common solution was the development of calendrical time, calendars. A calendrical time, of course, refers to the measurement of time in years. Most commonly, this was measured in relation to the reigning period of a monarch or patriarch. And many societies used regnal calendars and also developed solar and lunar calendars. However, these solar and lunar calendars were not commonly used to measure historical time in themselves, even if they were related. Now, it was such regnal calendars that allowed Ussher to build his 6,000-year chronology, or Flinders Petrie, to develop his methods of cross-dating. Now today, of course, we might still use regnal time in an offhand way. We talk about, for example, the Trump era, but historically, generally, we use another method. We use the Gregorian calendar based on the Anno Domini system. That is, all historical events are situated in relation to the years AD or BC. Or as I said earlier, now we changed it to BC and CE and BCE, sorry, Common Era and before Common Era. But essentially it's the same system. We change the labels, but the origin point doesn't change. The reference point of Christ's birth is still essentially the same. There are, of course, some methods of reckoning time, like in radiocarbon dating, we often use the word BP before present, which goes back to 1950. But even so, as archaeologists, we like to calibrate our dates, our BP dates into BC. It's just the way we think. We find it a lot more convenient to think historically in terms of the Gregorian calendar, because it's become for us the most natural way to understand time. The Anno Domini system goes back in Europe to the 9th century, but it wasn't at all a dominant way of reckoning time at that time. Regnal calendars were still very much remained in use right through into the early modern period. This is why I've got a picture of this handbook of dates here for students of English history, Cheney's Handbook of Dates. Basically converts regnal dates into contemporary chronology, because most administrative documents didn't use the Anno Domini system. They talked about the reign of such and such a king or such a queen, or the fourth year of the reign of so-and-so. And so you always had to convert these regnal systems into our Anno Domini system. Even if the Anno Domini system was known about and used, it wasn't a predominant method of reckoning time historically. Think about this archaeologically as well. As coins are a great classic use for archaeologists for dating deposits and dating layers. But coins as well didn't use the Anno Domini system. I think the first coin with an Anno Domini system that's been found in Europe is a Danish silver pfennig from the 13th century. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th century that such Anno Domini reckoning of dates on coins became much more common, as you can see in this Danish gold coin. Of course, in a sense, this example shows the dual system in operation, because you've got the Anno Domini date here, 1714, but you've also got the reign of the monarch here, Frederick IV, I think it is, the Danish king. Now, it was during the 16th century that our modern dating system started to be used more systematically on a whole range of objects, not just documents and coins. And this is something that's been explored really nicely by the archaeologist Harold Myton, where he basically looks at a variety of objects in Britain, from church bells to chests to gravestones and glassware and ceramics and so on. And what we're seeing is a fairly consistent trend in the rise of the use of the Anno Domini system on objects that pretty much starts to pick up in the late 16th century, increase dramatically over the 17th century, and then start to plateau out in the 18th century and become a fairly standard way to do it. What it suggests, and what you can also see in relation to written documents, is that basically over this time the Anno Domini system becomes common and dominant across a whole way of objects, and becomes ubiquitous. It becomes the way that people start to think about historical time. No longer are they living in the reign of King Edward, they're living in 1714, the year 7. It's a very, very different way of thinking about time, historical time, and I think it's very important to recognize this shift that is represented in the rise of the Anno Domini system and people's sense of historical consciousness. Now, Myton discusses this move and this rise as a dominance of linear time, and again, it's this kind of classic view of modern time consciousness as very linear, and he links it to an emergent new middle class seeking to distinguish itself from the older aristocracy and so on. And this is a story that's also been taken up by others. There's certainly no doubt there's a lot of changes going on in this period in the perception of time in the 17th and 18th century, which are linked to broader social changes as well. Also, of course, we can think of the use of clocks, which I'll come to in a moment. But I think it's really important to clarify what's going on in this picture and these changes that I'm talking about. Now, I tend to be very wary of oppositions. In discussions of time, you often see people talking about oppositions, about linear and cyclical, abstract and substantial. And I find them very problematic. And I think the linear cyclical opposition is one of the worst that we've got. It really tops my list of all-time worst oppositions to be playing with in time. I think we have to steer really clear of it. For example, modern scientific time is described as linear as opposed to the cyclical time traditional societies. And this has never really made much sense to me. I mean, the modern calendar is based on the solar year. You don't get more cyclical than that. And I've certainly no doubt that almost any society in history can conceptualize time in linear fashion in some form or another. General succession, simply getting old. Even as a particular description of historical time, it doesn't quite ring true either. Regnal calendars imply a certain linearity as well, while cyclical notions of history are not hard to find in our own history books. You just think of people like Toynbee and Spengler at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think I'm not going to talk about this in terms of that opposition of linear and cyclical, nor am I really going to talk about it in terms of another opposition, abstract and substantial. But it's important to pull it apart, these oppositions, because they're very easy and they come off the tongue very easily, but I don't think they carry a lot of fruitful weight when we think about them. This notion of abstract and substantial is equally problematic, and it gets again tagged onto these oppositions of Western, non-Western, modern, ancient. Last summer I was in a seminar on time in Nairobi, and one of the points that came up in the seminar was this opposition between Western time and African time. Now, Western time was all based along the clocks and singular, and African time was more substantial and embedded in social rhythms. And again, these oppositions are really problematic because Western time is equally substantial and embedded in rhythms. And people use clocks in Africa. It's just these oppositions are not helpful at all. Certainly, there's a question that an abstract sense of time emerged in this period in the 17th century. Of course, Isaac Newton's concept of absolute time was quite revolutionary and quite different. And it was abstract in a sense, but I think we can argue that there was abstract concepts of time before Newton. I don't think he had the monopoly on that concept at all. Here I want to draw on a paper by the historian Hayden White that he wrote a long time ago, reflecting on the structure of early medieval chronicles and annals, and reflecting on the notion of a secular time as somehow devoid of meaning in contrast to a Christian eschatology which underwrote the Anno Domini system. So he used an example here of the Annals of St. Gall that were written in the 8th to 10th century. And he notes the list of dates. So you've got these dates on the left-hand side with events on the right, but notice the gaps. This is what he points out to you. There are some gaps. There are some years that don't have any events on it. Why would he bother to write a year without any events on it? To Hayden White, this basically suggested that even in the 8th and 9th century, people could grasp a concept or had a concept of an abstract empty time where nothing happened. It was flowing. This notion of secular time as something which just passes, irrespective of what happens on Earth. And it was precisely this to underline this indifference of secular passing of time and contrast it with the world of events and also divine time that Hayden White suggested that we kind of recognize this element in early medieval time thinking. Now, this, of course, is not to suggest that the medieval monks anticipated Newton by several centuries. Certainly, Newtonian abstract time is very different to the kind of abstract time, if you want to call it that, here in these annals. The important point really is not to just argue about whether one is abstract and whether it's not, but really what's the rationale behind these two different systems and the rationale of thinking about time behind this. For the annalist, depicting the years where sometimes things happened and sometimes they didn't, the blank years are not really important. I mean, the fullness of secular history is given by this tally of years rather than by the events itself. The very indifference of secular time drew its force in opposition to other meanings of time, especially divine time or eternity. So here I'm going to throw up some other oppositions of my own, which don't rely on linear and cyclical or abstract and substantial, but really talk about historically embedded notions of oppositions, this distinction between secular time and eternity, the the timeliness, the atemporality of divine time of God. And also this other older Greek opposition in Greek thinking between chronos and kairos, whereas chronos can be conceived in a similar way to secular time and kind of the passing of time, and kairos is something slightly different. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, I think it helps to unpack these terms a little bit more, because even if medieval analysts and modern archaeologists both use, in a sense, the notion of abstract time, they carry very different meanings for each of us, even though they're both rendered in the same system, the Anno Domini system. And so we shouldn't take the fact that the Anno Domini system is continuous with the fact that it meant the same thing in all cases. If we take the first one on this opposition, for example, between secular time and eternity, when we think about eternity today, we often think of infinite time, endless time. But of course, eternity really is something that's outside time. The idea of endless time, there was another word for that in medieval Latin, the sempiternal, the kind of endless ongoing time. It's a very, very different concept to eternity as we might think about it today. And in fact, when this new concept, Newtonian concept of time was emerging in the 17th century, there was a lot of debate about what infinite time could possibly mean. You could read the discussions of people like Henry Moore and Descartes on this. They kind of endlessly discussed these problems about what this might mean. This other opposition between Chronos and Kairos is also, again, something we don't perhaps think automatically as two opposing things in our contemporary conceptions. It's inherited from Greek thought. But it's a distinction really which was quite important and played into medieval eschatology as well. It's best to think about these two terms in terms of thinking about time as a verb rather than a noun. We use the word time as a noun, and again, that gives it some substance, so we think it is something real. But if we think about time as a verb, as timing, then I think we much better capture the sense of what the two Greek meanings of words of this time was. So chronos means timing, as into time, how long something takes. So we can time the length of time it takes my lecture to happen. We could put an hourglass up and time it and so on. That sense of timing something. But kairos is another sense of timing. It's about choosing the right time, timing the right moment. You're all thinking, how the hell can I get out of this lecture without being seen? I've got to choose the right moment. That sense of kairos, of choosing the timing and the right moment, is a very, very different sense of timing. Now, of course, we can understand these senses of time and timeliness, but they're not dominating our way of thinking in the way they did in the past. And I think, again, it's important to understand the contemporary terms people are using and what oppositions are being set up at the contemporary times to understand the oppositions that are really at play here. So if we now bring it back to our modern concept of abstract time, I don't think we oppose that to kairos. We don't oppose it to eternity. I think rather we're working under a very, very different set of oppositions between what you might call world time and individual time, or physical time, or psychological time, or subjective time and objective time. These are the oppositions that you read in contemporary philosophy books or philosophy books of the 20th century. These are the things which obsessed people like Bergson and Heidegger, and also became chief points of contention, which I'm going to pick up again in my very last lecture, the fourth lecture. But they kind of speak to a very different sets of concerns and very different sets of interests, a very different cosmology and a different metaphysics, when humanity, in a sense, is at the center and replaces the polis or replaces God as the measure of all things. Now let me bring this back to archaeology and artifacts, because in a sense this opposition of world time and individual time is really played out again. If we go back to those objects that Harold Myton was talking about, one of the things about them is they don't just start to show Anno Domini dates. They're also often associated with names, with people, with individuals. Why people start to put dates on their buildings, or dates on pottery, or dates on tombstones, or dates on chests and pieces of furniture. They also put their initials and names on these same objects. Here's actually a rather more recent example from Iceland, but it's the same process going on there. It's someone's little box, handmade box, and they've got their name on one side with the date on the other. And it's this association between the individual's name and the date, which I think is not insignificant. It's relevant. In fact, it goes to the heart of the whole this change that I've been talking about. The inscriptions, in a sense, act to situate a particular individual within historical time. And they engendered this new sense of historical consciousness, one where the individual could coordinate their life within a broader timescale that was not mediated by the ruling monarch, as in regnal time. And this connection to the rise of individualism during this period is also too obvious to need explaining, even if the concept of individualism itself requires a lot of unpacking. Another way to frame this adoption of the Anno Domini system is that it democratized time. It enabled people to have a direct and unmediated relation to history, which regnal time did not. Yet it's important to remember that the Anno Domini system is essentially still a regnal calendar. The only difference is that it only acknowledges one reign, one ruler, of course, that of Jesus Christ. All time and history hinges around him. It's a regnal system distilled to one referent. We might call it a monoregnal calendar. This means, effectively, though, that you never have to reset your clock, whereas every time a new king or queen comes, your calendar started again from year one. With the Anno Domini system, it basically stayed the same all the way through. And the singularizing effect of this distillation shouldn't really go unnoticed, nor should the fact that, for example, just as under the Reformation, individual access to God was being promoted over the mediation of the church, so the adoption of the Anno Domini calendar over other regnal calendars expressed the ability of individuals to relate themselves directly to the notion of a historical time without the mediation of secular rulers. Paradoxically, the Christian calendar was crucial to the development of our modern secular notion of time. Thus, if the Anno Domini system enabled the conception of a singular historical time to emerge, it was only in conjunction with the rise of individualism that it started to become the dominant framework. This rise you see in the in the 17th century and 18th century. It was not until the 15th and 16th centuries that chronicle of events using the Anno Domini system also started to proliferate, followed soon after by the use of the system on documents and objects connected to specific individuals. Now, all this kind of development of a singular chronology, the Anno Domini system, is one thing, but it still only presents a singular view of time in one sphere, the sphere of historical time. You've still got multiple time rhythms going on in people's daily lives and so on. The rhythms of daily life would have been structured by specific practices relating to specific social and historical context, household routines, farming practices, religious rituals and festivals, and so on. And again, all of these have been subject to a lot of scrutiny by historians and sociologists and studies of social time. But of course, around the same time as this adoption of the Anno Domini system, you also get the increasing use of singularization time in these everyday routines as well. Of course, I'm talking about clocks here. Now, clocks have been around for a long time, not as long as calendars, though of course it really depends on what you define as a clock. Clocks, too, have been a link to the emergence of abstract time, modernity, and capitalism. But clocks and abstract time preceded capitalism and modernity by centuries, just as abstract calendrical time did. Certainly, clocks and clock time did play a critical role in capitalism and forging a new time consciousness in the early modern period, and this has been well documented. The important thing, though, is not their initial appearance, but their dominance. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, clock time was confined to specific spheres or domains of practice. In industry, particularly in certain trades like the textile guilds, or in philosophical discourse or early scientific experimentation. Clocks are also a fairly rare object. Most people would have encountered them only on church towers, like this one here. But over the 17th and 18th century, clocks became far more ubiquitous, and these have been tracked by historians looking at probate inventories and so on. So we know they started to become much more common in people's homes and also in workplaces. And they started to, of course, insinuate themselves and regulate people's lives, as, of course, we're all used to today. It's a familiar story, and it needs no more elaboration than that. What I want to focus on, really, in this role of clocks is not so much their role in singularizing quotidian time or daily time or whatever, but really how clocks got meshed into the calendar to create this universal time, this idea of a notion of a singular universal time which basically runs throughout everything. As clocks insinuated themselves into our daily lives, so they also started to increase in their resolution. What began as a machine to simply mark the hours soon started to add minutes and ultimately seconds. And it's paradoxically only when clocks started to increase their resolution down to the second that they also began to be used to coordinate calendrical time. I want to just explore this through an example. Think about this. I don't know what you were doing a month or so ago on New Year's Eve, if you were celebrating. But I bet if you were counting down the time to the beginning of the new year, of course you were counting down the seconds to the 1st of January. Why do we do that? Is it some obsession with precision? Why are we connecting this clock time to calendrical time in this really, really fundamental way? I think what it does is reflect the way the calendrical system has become so entangled and subordinated to clock time. And this is the crucial development, really, this kind of final piece of the puzzle that kind of creates this notion of a singular time that's important to recognize. But this, again, was a slow process. We don't count down the new year by the hour or even the minute. We do it by the second. It wasn't always like this. Here's a quote from Samuel Peeps' diary from 350 years ago, 31st of December, 1664. This is the end of his diary, the last entry on the evening of December 31st. Thence home to eat a little and so to bed. Soon as ever the clock struck 1, I kissed my wife in the kitchen by the fireside, wishing her a merry new year, observing that I believe I was the first proper wisher of it this year, for I did it as soon as ever the clock struck 1. Of course, doing it at 1 o'clock seems a bit strange to us. But the fact that he did it and was expressing it like this, I think is quite an interesting phenomenon. This is something I haven't done any great research on. I'm sure there's historians could tell me this in more detail. But I suspect this practice of marking down the new year isn't much older than the 16th, much older than the 17th century, and probably only became widespread much later on in the 18th and 19th century. Samuel Pepys clearly acknowledged the turn of the year through his clock in the 1660s, but there were no second hands there, and probably no even minute hands on his clock. It was just to the hour that was enough. Now, this full coordination of clock time and calendrical time only really crystallized and became fully concrete at the end of the 19th century, with the adoption of Greenwich meridian as the prime meridian, and the Greenwich Mean Time as the basis for a coordinated universal time. The initial impetus for coordinating time was, of course, long-distance travel, originally on ships and later the railways. And the critical tool for this coordination was the chronometer, essentially a very, very accurate clock. It was used as the standard to measure time at the Greenwich Observatory, and other clocks were calibrated against it. Since the 1960s, we've switched over to atomic clocks as the ultimate standard. Today, following the International Organization of Standardization, the second is currently recognized as the basic unit of time in the International System of Units. All larger units, minutes, hours, days, and years are defined in reference to the second. The second itself is measured as the vibration of a cesium-133 atom in international atomic time. So coordinated universal time, or UTC, is set to a mean solar time at Greenwich meridian. However, because the time of the solar day varies slightly, it has to be adjusted, which it is, to the atomic clock of cesium. UTC has been calibrated against the cesium clock since 1972, and over which time the difference between the solar day and the atomic day has varied by 27 seconds. Now, again, I think the importance about this is the work and effort that goes in to synchronize all these different timescales and different temporalities and rhythms, that it's something that we just take for granted. The singularity of time is actually the work of a lot of effort and a lot of achievement to calibrate multiple different systems and multiple different objects. You know, at the bottom, we've got the cesium atom. At the top, we've got the Earth going around the sun. These are two very different physical processes I mentioned. And to bring them together requires an awful lot of work. So our contemporary calendars, even if they still use the Christian notation dating back more than 1,000 years, they're not regnal at all. They're not calibrated against the lives of kings or the Son of God. They're calibrated against the oscillation of a cesium-133 atom. What the synchronization of calendrical and clock time did was a step towards synchronization on a whole new level. While the Anno Domini system provided a means to replace or stitch together successive regnal calendars into a unified system, the units both used in both the regnal and Anno Domini system were the same. They were essentially years. But with the advent of universal time, now different times were coordinated. You've got seconds and years and multiple subdivisions thereof. This is a singularization of a whole new kind, one which is infinitely scalable up and down. It's the same kind of singularization that is performed every time we want to generate a C14 date expressed in calendrical years. It's the same thing we're trying to do there. We're trying to coordinate and synchronize the decay rate of a C14 atom isotope with the time it takes the Earth to go around the sun. It's not easy. So now it's a good time to I'm trying to try and cap up now and close off and return briefly to archaeology at the end. I've spent a lot of time kind of to remind ourselves in a sense of the socially constructed nature of time, and particularly time as we understand it in historical sciences, and this notion of an absolute chronology and this notion of singular time. We often characterize this kind of time as abstract and linear, but these are just not really at all particularly modern. Just read Aristotle or St. Augustine, you'll find these same concerns expressed there. I think far more important is this notion of singularity, this work that goes into synthesizing and synchronizing and producing a singular time, which is both extendable and scalable. And its singularity, as I said over and over again, is not easy to achieve. Christian cosmology helped this with the adoption of a single calendar, expressed through the Anno Domini system, but it was not until this became commonly used as the principal chronology over the 17th and 18th centuries that it helped create a kind of universal time. But once you bring in clocks, then you create even another different level of singularization. Now, arguably, of course, we still experience other times, other rhythms and tempos outside this calendrical clock nexus. But as archaeologists, it's this chronological system that dominates and frames so much of what we do. Why? Well, of course, the short answer is it's really useful. It allows us to compare and analyze through a universal yardstick. It's a ruler for measuring different aspects of the temporality of events. It's a universal translator, like money, which converts any commodity into any other. An absolute chronology can convert a parcel of the world into a form comparable with any other. Now, neither the spatial metaphor of a ruler nor the market metaphor of money is accidental here, of course. Concepts of space, like time, underwent a similar set of changes in European society over this same period. And both were clearly related to the emergence of capitalism, the dominance of market and consumer economy, mediated by money. Now, this metrological and singularized conception of time came at a cost. I don't need to repeat all the philosophical arguments about how this results in a very impoverished and reductive notion of time. Philosophers like Bergson and Heidegger have covered this ground very well, and these are issues which I'm going to take up more in subsequent lectures. Since the beginning of the 20th century, though, the notion of time in many sciences, in fact, has also undergone a little bit of reversal from this story. I've talked about how, over the past 300 years, we've been trying to create this notion of a singular time through absolute chronology. At the same time as we reached this point, in the beginning of the 20th century, Einstein was deconstructing it with relativity theory, and this just is carried on relentlessly. This, again, these are subjects I'm going to take up more in my last talk. But similar trends towards an acknowledgement of the multiplicity of time emerged in archaeology, of course, in the last quarter of the 20th century. And these are also subjects that I'm going to spend much more attention to on the next 2 nights. But let me just end by really, in a sense, before I completely move off the subject of absolute chronology, just end by kind of reminding us what absolute chronology does for us as archaeologists. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that the great benefit of an absolute chronology over a relative one is that it measures duration, not just sequence. It tells us how long something was. How long did it last? How quickly did it happen? Now, there are 2 major consequences of this. One is tempo, the speed at which things happen, the rate at which things change. How quickly did this happen, for example? The other aspect is this notion of synchrony or contemporaneity. Did X happen at the same time as Y? Now, neither of these are really possible or very easy with relative chronologies, except as very coarse guesses. So when C14 came in, it was really opened up the possibilities in archaeology. It became possible to answer some of these questions in a way that wasn't possible before. But it was a slow process. The first flush of C14 dates probably had the greatest impact in rethinking the chronology of European prehistory. Larger chunks were reordered, for example, moving the Neolithic of Britain back from originally just before the radiocarbon revolution, when it was put to about 2000 BC, back to initially 3,200, and of course now onto 4,000 BC or so. But the initial high hopes of C14 often did not come through. Problems emerged, as I talked about, all kinds of problems in the accuracy and the precision of the dating. Now, C14 dates, as you know, are always expressed as probabilities, the probability of the sample dating to within a specific range. And archaeologists slowly realized they had to accept that these ranges are often quite large, sometimes a century or more. It's still better than nothing, of course, but in terms of issues of tempo and synchronicity, that is how fast or slow things happened, were things happening at the same time, a century is, or 2 centuries is not really very good resolution to start to grapple with these questions. Some archaeologists responded to this problem by saying that such resolution was never going to be possible, and we should really, as archaeologists, stick with the long-term, larger-scale processes. In the last decades, questions of temporal scale have become increasingly a matter of concern. And again, I'm going to touch on these more in my tomorrow's lecture. But in the last decade or 15, 20 years, there's been this new developments in radiocarbon, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, this kind of Bayesian modeling, which has enabled us to rethink some of these questions of tempo and synchronicity again, and make answering some of these questions more conceivable. Again, you're probably all familiar with the work of people like Alistair Whittle and Alex Bayliss on Bayesian modeling and the developments it's had on the British Neolithic and European Neolithic through their projects gathering time and the times of their lives. Dealing with radiocarbon and being able to fine-tune it and get dates down to maybe the decade level is really changing the game quite substantially. Where before we saw continuity, now we see hiatus and gaps. Where before we saw even spreads and even tempos, now we have fluctuating tempos, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Once we can control the duration of time down to this scale, as Bayesian modeling seems to promise, at least in some cases, then these questions about speed and synchronization take on a whole new level of relevance that perhaps they didn't have for archaeology before. Once you can get archaeology down to the level of resolution of history, these questions become far more pertinent and far more problematic. But they also bring a whole new set of questions that really need to be addressed, which is what I'm really going to do over the next couple of nights. Now, my sense is that there's almost a belief that simply increasing our scale of resolution is enough. Once we've done that, we've solved all our problems. All archaeological problems are really just about solving the clock, how to date things and to date things more precisely. Now, even though I fully endorse this kind of work and think it's totally necessary, and the more we can do to increase our resolution, the better, I don't believe it's going to be the solution to everything. I believe there are still problems facing us which have nothing whatsoever to do with our ability to refine our dating. It's these issues I want to really address over the next couple of evenings, particularly focusing on issues of tempo and change tomorrow, and then issues of synchrony and contemporary on Wednesday. But I feel like I've talked for too long, and so I'm going to stop. And thank you for your attention. Okay.